Hello and welcome to the November 18th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I'm Anthony Bardaway, here with my colleague Romeo Kukratsky.
Hey, y'all.
This week will be a news roundup episode. Last week was a special topics. I hope you all enjoyed that, but back to the news. So this episode will basically have three segments to it. The first will be about combat, as always, followed up by an analysis of the current situation by Commander-in-Chief Valerii Zaluzhnyi in an article he wrote in The Economist. The next section will be about two, kind of grim episodes orchestrated either by Russian forces or Russian civilians. And then we'll round off with a bit of good news of Ukraine possibly advancing in its European Union aspirations. But first, of course, is our combat update. Russia continues in its counteroffensive against Ukrainian forces as Ukraine has slowed down with its summer and fall offensive, things in the Zaporizhia region. The breach in the Russian lines continues to be widened meter by meter, but most analysts seem to think that it will not be reaching especially further going into the winter. Things are shifting around due to the weather and having to look at the winter situation. And of course, it's just been going on for a long time and all offensives culminate. But as it changes around to Russia kind of taking its turn to have offensives, we focus on Avdiivka. Where we last left off, Russia had taken a chunk of positions to the north of Avdiivka while sputtering out trying to advance to the city's south. They are trying to surround it on both ends. It's one of those oddly shaped cities that is very kind of oblong. So picture like an oval tilted between northwest, southeast. Russia is trying to go around both sides to surround the city, trying to do a repeat of Bakhmut, where they captured both flanks of the city, making the defense of Bakhmut more difficult. Same with Severodonetsk. That's what they're now trying to do to Avdiivka. But in our update since this last time we were talking about it, about 3 weeks ago, Russia has not advanced too much further. Everything is very much a game of meters right now, and this is not a very large area. And in fact, there was an instant of Russia beginning to push a little bit beyond the railroad leading into Avdiivka. But now that I'm looking at more recent updates, Ukraine was able to push them back against the railroad. So right now, Russia has not really advanced in the last month or so since they began this assault in Avdiivka. However, it is still producing a tremendous amount of casualties. So in this area that is even smaller than Bakhmut, we are seeing the same numbers of Russian casualties that we did during the height of their attack on Bakhmut, with the difference is that now, because they're also using a lot of armor personnel characters, tanks, vehicles of different forms. This is a much more open territory. They're also facing extremely high losses of combat vehicles as well. But that said, it is a very, very perilous position for Ukraine to be in. It is a very small salient. This was, an industrial suburb, just outside of Donetsk. It's not very large. It's quite far away from a lot of Ukrainian supply lines. Bakhmut had the advantage of not being too far away from Chasiv Yar, which was not that far away from Slovyansk, Kostiantynivka. In this case, it is Avdiivka. The fact that it is kind of distanced away from other Ukrainian strong points is also a thing to worry about, in that there is only one good road into the city at this point, and that road is quite long, longer than it was to get into Bakhmut. So take the optimistic view of just the sheer loss of Russian personnel and material, but also weigh that against how poor of a position that Avdiivka is in. And will continue, and my guess will be that this will continue to be the main Russian attack, at least through the end of the year, going into next year. I think that Avdiivka will hold. just because Russia has been not able to take so many gains in so long, and they are taking so many losses, but we'll see where that goes. Like, don't treat this too preciously, I think. Next, talking about some behind enemy lines attacks, Mikhail Filipenko, the former leader of the Luhansk People's Republic's militia, was assassinated. And unlike a lot of the times where Ukrainian military intelligence will often kind of play it coy of, oh, who knows what could have happened? In this case, the next day, they just said, we did it. Yes, we're the ones who did it. What are you going to do about it? Which kind of accents the increasing role that Ukrainian covert ops and, wet work is taking in this war, including additional activities on the African continent where Ukrainian special forces and military intelligence are directly engaging with Russian forces and mercenaries. And we have seen more and more evidence of that as even since our previous episode. And the last bit of update is that we have seen at least one Russian warship, possibly three, destroyed. The most important of these was the Askold corvette. The Askold was one of the most modernized ships in at least the Russian Black Sea Fleet, if not the fleet overall, and was being used to launch missiles at Ukraine. So that's one very deadly weapons platform that is taken out of the picture. And the other two were landing craft, mostly used for anti-aircraft missions by Russia. So the Russian Black Sea Fleet continues to be whittled away more and more. Once again, as we've talked about in the past, losing the battle for the Black Sea to a country that does not have a navy on its own. But this is getting now into our first kind of topical issue for the episode, which is that Commander-in-Chief Valerii Zaluzhnyi, the overall commander of Ukrainian forces, a very popular figure, very well respected, published an article in The Economist entitled Modern Positional Warfare and How to Win It, where he describes how the fighting in the war has become a grinding war of attrition, and the positional in this means that every gain is very marginal, often quite important, but often small. And he puts forth his recommendations for how to switch from this grinding attritional warfare back to the active maneuver warfare that we saw in the liberations of Kharkiv and Kherson regions. So, Romeo, can you give a rundown of what his points in this article were?
Sure. He has about 5 key aspects that he drills down on. First, why Ukraine has entered into this kind of positional attrition war, as well as how to overcome it, and of course his suggestions for what Ukraine actually needs to get back to the fighting a war that's favorable on Ukraine's terms. I think it's not especially controversial to note that Russia has a substantially larger population, economic base and industrial base, especially military industrial base, than Ukraine does. And in this sort of attritional 50 meters there, 50 meters back, trench to trench combat, Ukraine does not really have an advantage. And the longer that goes on, the more risky the situation is for Ukraine, which Zaluzhnyi, of course, points out in this article. So the 5 key points that he lists are air superiority. So a major part of modern Western and NATO combat doctrine is a heavy reliance on air superiority. Air superiority means that you can safely launch air missions in enemy territory without worrying about your planes being blown out of the sky. No one in Ukraine has that, not the Ukrainians, not the Russians. As a result of this lack of air superiority, neither side can rely on airstrikes to take out artillery, to take out entrenched positions, to soften up logistics centers far behind enemy lines, which results in an inability to kind of use one of the key aspects of modern warfare. Obviously, if you can call a plane to bomb an artillery piece, you don't have to engage in our battery fire. which is one of his other points. The Russians have, despite all of the memes and jokes of how stupid the Russians are, and yes, they do a lot of very stupid things, they are still improving at what they need to improve at. Zaluzhnyi points out that counter battery fire, which is basically targeting an enemy's artillery emplacements and artillery pieces, the Russians have gotten a lot better at this. They used to be very, very bad. They were not able to take out much of Ukrainian artillery in these artillery duels because of Ukraine's very strong reliance on scoot and shoot, which is when you shoot your artillery at a certain location and then you immediately move. And this is that's possible mostly due to the use of Western artillery pieces, things like the M270s, which are trunk mounted. And as a result, after you've expended your shots for that round, you can simply drive away. A lot of the older Soviet towed artillery or fixed artillery pieces take a lot more time to set up and to break down after they've shot. Russia has started using Lancet kamikaze drones, or I shouldn't say started. They have begun relying more on these Lancet kamikaze drones as their response for counter battery fire. If it's taking too long from when your position gets shelled to getting your own artillery in place and then shelling the place where you thought where you think the enemy was shelling you from, you can simply launch a drone and try and hit that position almost immediately. And this has really tamped down on the effectiveness of Ukrainian scoot and shoot methods, since the drones can be launched again basically instantly. And with that comes electronic warfare, which is a massive, massive part of this conflict because of this heavy reliance on drones. Electronic warfare, of course, is not only about jamming drones, but also about messing with the enemy's communication systems. We heard a lot of stories at the beginning of the war about how the Russians were so unprepared for this kind of stretched out invasion process that they would often rely on civilian communication networks, civilian cell towers. They would use unencrypted cell phones to receive and send back reports to command. It was a major mess. However, again, this is another aspect in which the Russians have improved. They are using military-only encrypted frequencies more often. More Russian units in the fields have access to this high-tech equipment, and they've gotten better at jamming both Ukrainian comms and, of course, Ukrainian control systems for their drones. Though that's not to say that Ukraine itself is not engaging in the same. But the widespread use of these tactics and their ubiquity, I think, really highlights how critical electronic warfare and electronic warfare countermeasures have become in modern conflicts. Zaluzhnyi also lists another major factor, and I really want to say this again, major factor for why Ukraine has found itself in this positional war instead of a much quicker NATO-styled assault is simply because of Russia's minefields. He says that in some areas, these minefields reach depths of 20 kilometers. That is 20 kilometers of no man's land that you have to breach while being assaulted by drones and artillery. And there's no way to physically get from point A to point B without going through that minefield. This means, Zaluzhnyi argues, that the world needs to very, very heavily invest in mine breaching tech, in demining technology, in mine sensing technology, in novel and innovative radar technology in order to be able to spot these mines. Because in a lot of cases, even if you do breach a minefield, Russia has mine laying weapons that can reseed those minefields in a very short span of time. You can breach a minefield, send units through that breach, start engaging the enemy in their trenches, only to find that when you need to retreat and head back to your lines, the road back is cut off because it's been remined. Ukraine's main mine breaching tech is mostly Soviet era, is incredibly outdated, and is simply not fit for combating such widespread usage of mines that Russia is engaging. And finally, Zaluzhnyi noted that there is a manpower differential between Ukraine and Russia, which I think is to no one's surprise. Russia has approximately 100 million more people than Ukraine does. as a result, it can field more men. It can put more men into the field, and these men may not be very well trained. They may not have any military experience or know how to do anything at all. Their morale may be low, but it can put them on the field, and quantity does have a quality all its own. What this means is that not only does Ukraine just have a general disadvantage in manpower, but that it's difficult to train up new units for Ukraine. Not only are there political obstacles in ramping up conscription, but in order to train conscripts, you need experienced soldiers. And typically, nearly every experienced soldier is already on the front. Taking a trainer back means rotating one of these very necessary guys from the front back to the rear so they can spend a couple of months, 3-4 months in training before they have to be sent out again. This makes it really hard to get units that are not just trained how to use new Western weapons, because these weapons, and let's be frank, a lot of people, I think, overemphasize how complicated these weapons are. These weapons are made for like 18-year-olds from like the Rust Belt to use. They are not that complicated. What is complicated, however, is marrying the technical knowledge of what buttons to press with the actual combat experience that lets you use these weapons effectively. I think reasonable complaint that I've seen about Ukraine's use of the Western weapons it receives is that these weapons are often given to completely new units who filled with greenhorns, just completely unexperienced, newly mobilized guys who may know, again, the technical aspects of using whatever the artillery piece or ECM it is, but that don't have the instincts that come with already having been and used in a live combat situation. To rectify this, Zaluzhnyi recommends a couple of things. One is, of course, resolving the political issues with ramping up conscription. And that's not something that is really up to him. It is, of course, up to the civilian government to take these suggestions into account. And we have seen some signs with Zelensky a few months ago, firing the heads of all of the military recruiting centers in every single region and replacing them with active duty soldiers, but also to mix in conscripts with these experienced units that cannot be rotated. A lot of guys on the front have repeatedly said in interviews and in their own reporting that they haven't been rotated for a year and a half, which is incredibly long. Modern militaries typically will rotate units after 3-4 months on the front because it's really difficult to be fighting for that long without any major reprieves. Humans typically tend to break down. But as I noted earlier, there's no real choice because the new guys are not going to hold the positions as well. They aren't going to know how to respond to Russian feints. They won't have the experience necessary to tell when a Russian assault is serious and when it can be ignored or dealt with in a simpler manner. And of course, they'll simply break more easily. Guys aren't needed. Zaluzhny's solution for this is to mix in these conscripts with these frontline units. A lot of these frontline units are or considered very elite units, and are often very picky about who they let in, but that will likely have to change given the paucity of manpower that Ukraine is facing. But of course, this is a solvable issue, even though this manpower differential will always remain. 100 million Russians are not going to disappear from the face of the planet anytime soon. But there are multiple ways of at least making it up where it counts. He also notes that there are a couple of other kind of priorities to focus on that may not be key, but would improve Ukraine's warfighting capability immensely. That is improving Ukraine's command and control infrastructure, which still works in a very kind of Soviet manner. The way information is passed on from a grunt in the field to HQ in a bunker somewhere is needlessly bureaucratic, is 40 to 50 year olds outdated, and often doesn't really account for the the changes and the innovations that we've seen in the modern battlefield, which is why Zaluzhnyi argues to integrate more tech solutions into the CNC process. And of course, to optimize the overall way that intelligence, communications, recon, and surveillance come together and are processed by HQ and then passed back down into the field. And of course, any military expert worth their salt will love to lecture you on logistics. Logistics is what wins and decides wars. Ukraine has a massive issue in logistics because a good portion of our weapons are not produced by us and are not sent on our timetables. That is, the West will send us aid on their political timetables. And it is often, for these Western countries, at home, a political question, not a material warfighting one bought out of necessity. Whether or not Ukraine will receive 10 tanks instead of 30, for example. On top of that, all of the different mixed units and tanks and equipment materiel that Ukraine has received makes it a lot harder to maintain. If, for example, you only have 10 of a given model of APC and it breaks down or takes combat damage, you will either need to cannibalize one of the remaining 9 APCs to fix the one that has broken down, or wait until you are given the correct repair parts from whatever nation donated you the equipment in the first place. As a result, Ukraine needs to set up its own production lines and shift to relying more on domestic production of weapons, not the Soviet era junk that Ukraine has kind of been forced to rely on in large numbers, but modern weapons. Of course, this is very complicated by the fact that Russia's missiles can strike any target in the country. And they have struck Ukrainian weapons factories repeatedly, including one that is 3 kilometers from my apartment where I'm sitting right now. Under these conditions, it's really difficult to build up a military industrial complex. But Zaluzhnyi, of course, argues that despite this difficulty, it is something absolutely necessary to winning the war effort. And I think I'm in agreement. We can see how political, let's say, perturbations in the United States, for example, have thrown into question large amounts of aid and military funding for Ukraine. And God forbid if the United States suddenly has a political regime in place that is no longer as amenable to the Ukrainian cause as the current authorities, then we're in big trouble. We are in really big trouble. And the only way to ensure that Ukraine can keep fighting regardless of what the political conditions are in the West and amongst partners is to improve its own domestic industrial base. But again, even if these things are done today or yesterday or a month ago, it is likely to take years and years for those results to pay off. So this is more of kind of a long-term thing.
So that's the broad article. There's a long version of the article that I'll link in the description, as well as like a truncated version for more mass consumption with less technical details and such in it. This lit a fire under the Ukrainian commentariat, both here and abroad. There was a lot of, gasping of, Zaluzhnyi is saying that like we're stuck in a stalemate and all is lost. Well, no, what he said was, here are the problems in front of us, and here is how we can fix them. And with the exception of Ukrainian domestic production, which will be a Herculean effort, everything else was very much achievable. The first parts of the list were basically about technology, and the solutions to these problems the United States, Europe already kind of has, and it's just a matter of getting that equipment in Ukrainian hands instead of being lost in the political process. Whereas some of the others, such as training up reservists, is more of an organizational issue, which is harder to fix, but still doable. And there have already been steps taken in order to fix them. So this is a problem, and it is a problem that has caused other problems, but it is one that is very fixable. So there is also a lot of discussion about possible arguments between Zaluzhnyi and other branches of the government, including the presidential office. The presidential office came out with its own statement saying that no, Ukraine is not stuck in a stalemate, which I think was overinterpreted, is being presented as like some epic struggle between these two, which I don't think there's much proof of otherwise.
And look, folks, no matter what anyone tells you, no one knows what goes on at Bankova except for the people who work there. There are a lot of articles based on anonymous sources of one sort or another about these supposed conflicts. They've been there since the start of the war. Half of them are probably propaganda, and untangling the truth of the matter is honestly, in my opinion, irrelevant. Are there conflicts?
It's the gossip columns.
Yeah, they're basically gossip columns. Are there conflicts? I'm sure there are, because humans have opinions. The civilian authorities have will often have slightly different priorities than the military leadership. But at the end of the day, Ukraine is a democracy. Zaluzhnyi answers to the supreme commander, who is the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. But at the same time, Zelensky has not shown that he has a particular desire or capability to micromanage the war, to tell the military what it has to do. While Zelensky's administration has always been very PR focused, I don't think that there has been enough evidence that this has impinged on Ukraine's ability to conduct a war beyond the pre-existing issue that it had. And as we saw in the first year of this conflict, the civilian government was more than happy to step aside and let the military take the lead and win the victories that it did. It didn't do that because Zelensky decided to. These were military operations. So whatever conflicts that there are, I think they are a sideshow and distraction, and trying to figure out which of them could possibly be true is not worth anyone's time or effort.
And with that, we'll move on to our next segment, which is, well, atrocities. There were two very public Russia-based crimes, mass crimes. One of them cost people's lives. The other did not, but was still very politically relevant. And we're going to start with on October 27th in the town of Volnovakha, which is in the occupied Donetsk region. Occupied since the beginning of the full-scale war. It was not part of the occupation authorities of the DNR prior to that. This is a more recent conquest by Russia. There was a family, the Kopkanets family, who a group of soldiers approached their house and told them that they needed their house to have soldiers. To house soldiers. The father told the soldiers, no, we need a place to live. You cannot take our house. The soldiers left, came back later in the night, and slaughtered everyone there. There were 9 people in the family at this house, and every last one of them was killed, including in their beds. There was, of course, shock at this horrific massacre, to the point where even the Russian authorities went through the motions of arresting 2 suspects in the murder, Anton Tsepov and Stanislav Rov, I believe is his name, Stanislav Rov. And they went through the motions of at least treating it like a criminal offense. But everyone who's paid attention to any of the information that's come out of the occupied territories can tell you that this is a fairly common occurrence. People within the occupied territories are constantly being abused. We have so many stories that we have not always focused on because they are so common, of Russian soldiers basically doing whatever they want, theft, rape, murder, and getting away with it. And the fact that 2 soldiers were actually arrested is an extreme anomaly. I kind of talked about this in one of our paid newsletters about how the occupied territories by Russia have become kind of a zone of lawlessness where people can behave however they want to abuse the locals. Honestly, very typically colonial situation. there's not much to say about this other than it happened. It will continue to happen. Every town, every village where people live and continue to live under Russian occupation, this is what's going to happen there. They'll be murdered 1 at a time, 2 at a time, 9 at a time. In this case, as Russia imposes the Russian world on them. If there's any updates on this, we'll let you know, but I don't think there will be. This will fade into the background into being just one more incident that occurs in Russian occupied territory. And even looking at just the DNR during the kind of cold phase of the war where the DNR was allowed to do whatever it wanted within Donetsk, we all have friends who say that, some mobster said that their apartment now belonged to them instead. And with the implied threat of, if you don't do this, something's going to happen to you. So they left because of that. But moving on to this other atrocity that occurred, we're going to look to Dagestan, the capital of Dagestan, Makhachkala, Dagestan. So Dagestan is in the Caucasus Mountains of Russia. It is it's in between Chechnya and the Caspian Sea, and immediately north of Azerbaijan. So this is a very complicated situation, but I'll do my best to explain it. So what happened was, so consider this all happening within the context of the current Israel-Gaza war and the upswell of anti-Semitic incidences that have occurred in relation to it. So what happens is a plane arrives from Israel to Dagestan. There is news of this plane coming in that spreads around local Telegram channels and word of mouth, saying that these Israelis are coming into our airport. We have to stop them. So what happens is that there's a mob that appears at the airport demanding to find Jews. They kind of rampage around the airport. They demand that the flight staff and the airport staff hand over any Jews that may be there. This is a classical pogrom of a mostly disorganized mob demanding to see Jews and presumably, when acquiring said Jews, beating them up, murdering them, robbing them, etc. However, in this case, it seemed as though there weren't any Jews there. So thankfully, there weren't any casualties. There was one incident of a guy from Uzbekistan who was mistaken as an Israeli, and he was kind of tossed around by the crowd a little bit without serious injury, I don't believe. So in the end, I don't believe anyone was seriously hurt. But this incident of pogrom happening at an airport, and keep in mind for everything else that airports tend to be pretty secure places.
Yeah, it's difficult to imagine that this occurred without any administrative knowledge that it would occur.
And funny that you say that part, because it took the police several hours to respond to this. And when the riot police
at an airport,
if there's two things you do not mess with, it is airports and commercial ports, because there will be a crackdown on you, no matter where you are. And it took the police several hours to respond. And when they did show up, they basically just made sure that the mob did not damage anything too expensive. They did not really take any effort to protect people who could have been there. Just, guarded the expensive stuff. So make sure that it wasn't smashed up. I believe it took 3 hours for any arrest to actually take place. They eventually did rough people up, but keep in mind that this very delayed response, in Dagestan, when there had been previous protests against conscription or just about anything, it's a very restive province. There's often protests of one kind or another. The police send in the skull crackers very quickly, and they crack skulls. In this case, it didn't seem like it was that much of a priority to them.
Yeah, there's little doubt that this particular incident was either explicitly planned by or simply allowed by the powers that be in Dagestan. There's zero reason to believe that the authorities did all they could and really care.
Yeah. So why did this happen? Well, first of all, yes, this is, like I said, this is happening in the context of the Gaza war. If you look at the news, there are protests all over the world. Some of these protests, not all of them, have turned quite anti-Semitic and have even turned into attacks of some kind. People have been stabbed, shot, vandalism all over the world. In this case, it gets a bit more interesting. So Dagestan is kind of the oldest part of Russia. If you look at most of Russia, it's a country that, came to power in the Middle Ages. There are some countries where a couple hundred years is a long time. There are some countries where a couple thousand years is a long time. Derbent in Dagestan is the oldest city in Russia. This is part of the kind of Persian world that was eventually taken over by Russians. And as a part of that, there is a very, very, very old Jewish community in Dagestan. They're referred to as the Mountain Jews. They spoke a Persian language and had moved there, like 2,000 years ago. And have since kind of integrated into being another Caucasian people. Historically, the Caucasus hasn't had much of an issue with anti-Semitism just because there are so many ethnicities, and so many of these ethnicities have fought each other at various times. It's kind of weird for just one of those ethnicities to be the one that everyone picks on exclusively. So, anti-Jewish violence would not be any more special than violence against any other ethnic group who happens to be there. And there are dozens or even hundreds of groups of people within the mountains. Makhachkala, it's also interesting in that at one point it was even the capital of the Khazar Khanate. The Khazar Khanate, the very large kind of Turkish horde that ruled over large parts of Ukraine as well. Well, that's one of their capitals. So currently, though, the Jewish population there is not especially large. It's only about 1,200 people. Basically, it's about 1/10 of the size that it was during Soviet times, because as soon as people were allowed to leave, they left. So many of them moved to Moscow as the kind of, imperial capital where there's more jobs. There's a lot of mountain Jews in various industries, including the entertainment industry in Russia. Many of them moved to Israel, America, to the point where there's currently only 300 to 400 families. And some of the more recent anti-Semitic activity in Dagestan has caused that number to dwindle further, to the point where the Jewish communal leaders there say that with this pogrom, this could kind of be the end of it, where people will feel so unsafe that they're going to put an end to 2,000 years of Jewish habitation in the region to move elsewhere. The factors behind this is for example, the increase in Islamism. More fundamentalist streams of Islamism have entered into Dagestan since the 90s, which is often hostile to Jews. The violence of the 90s, the various wars, the Chechen wars, the mafia attacks even as its own form of war. It was a very violent region in the 90s, less violent now, but still quite violent. Not the most safe place to live, has thrown people out. And now just the general shittiness of living in Russia is driving people out. So overall, these factors in this pogrom is really only one more symptom of something that comes to an end of push factors for immigration. But there's also the day before, there is an attack on the Jewish Community Center in Nalchik in Kabardino-Balkaria, a neighboring region in the Caucasus. In 2013, the rabbi of Derbent in Dagestan was shot. It's a very tenuous kind of situation for any Jews living in Russia more generally. The Moscow rabbi just left the country, and his family is kind of being harassed and hunted. But in this specific part of Russia, which is much more politically difficult, much more lawless than even Moscow, it kind of creates the breeding ground for things like that. And this brings it more into kind of what Romeo was hinting at, is it's also very possible that the authorities knew about this. In fact, it seems quite probable that the Russian authorities knew about this, and we may have even fallen back into the old Russian pattern of, if people are going to be mad at the government, isn't it better they be mad at the Jews instead? If you look back at one of our previous episodes, we talked about the development of Russian anti-Semitism, and this was a big part of it. In order to distract people from their anger at the Tsar, wouldn't it be better if they're mad at the Jews instead?
Mind you, that is perhaps part of the reasoning behind why so many of Russia's oligarchs are Jewish, simply because Jews have trouble building political bases, independent political bases in Russia. And as a result, Putin can be assured that his pet oligarchs cannot form locuses of resistance to him or locuses of independence, despite being so rich and influential. Just another example of the Russian state relying on a age-old tactic to keep its populace in place.
It's a pressure valve. It's a pressure valve of, instead of being mad at the government, be mad at the Jews instead. And a very interesting point here is that the riot was partially, though not entirely, this has been overreported, but at least partially organized in an opposition Telegram channel, Morning Dagestan, which is mostly about spreading information about how the government's bad, or organizing protests against the government. And like I said, a lot of their protests that are also organized through Morning Dagestan are immediately shut down, and this one wasn't. So this is all, conspiratorial. There's no evidence that this is what it happened, but considering all the patterns of the past, it seems notable that they're able to take this oppositionist energy and channel it into a direction that does not threaten the Russian state. There's also other factors. A lot of the media in Dagestan, which is either owned or influenced by various sources connected to Chechen warlord Kadyrov, have been pumping out anti-Semitism all the time. And of course, Kadyrov is, in a problematic way, but is subordinate to the Russian government and a part of the Russian government. So whatever is coming out of Kadyrovite media is in service of the Russian government, or at least his place within it, and anti-Semitism is a part of that. Everything just points to it not being organized by the state, but they left the hole open for them to walk through, we'll just say. It's much, in any defense, you want to have a weak point to lull the enemy into attacking, and that's anti-Semitism. But like I said, no one was hurt in this pogrom. It seemed as though this plane was mostly carrying people who went to Israel for medical treatment, which is very common. Israel is the country in the Russian-speaking world with the best medical system. As I've said before, I had lived in Israel in the past, and if you go to the hospital, a lot of the doctors speak Russian. I had a doctor come to my apartment at one point. His house calls are a very normal way of doing things there, and he was from Uzbekistan and spoke Russian. It's very easy to go to Israel and receive services of many kinds, including medical, in Russian. So if you are from Russia and you want to get good medical treatment or things like that, you can go there and it can kind of feel like home, just higher quality. So that's why most people were on this plane, and not because they were Jews. And because of that, no one was hurt. But again, this is a very troubling thing. I mentioned before, probably near the start of the war, that if things go bad for Russia, they will do what they always do and blame the Jews. But in the intervening time, this happened on October 29th, there has been reactions since then. In Russian media space, this has in many ways been treated as, this is not Russia that did this. This was Dagestanis who did this. And that's a completely different thing. It's those people in the Caucasus, those Muslims, those Dagestanis who are backwards people, not truly Russian. So there's been a heavy dose of racism in there. That's often the stereotype in Russia, is that the Dagestanis are violent, warlike people who are not Russian unless they're athletes competing for Russia. Then they become Russian. And within Dagestan, the reaction to it has mostly been, they shouldn't have done this, but, they're just, a bunch of young guys who felt strongly about a good motivation, protecting the Palestinians, and they just went a bit too far with it. So, don't do anything too harsh with them. Boys will be boys. It's all okay.
What's a little anti-Semitism between lads, eh?
Yeah, it's, who hasn't done a pogrom when they were 22? It's just something we all do.
I mean, we're joking, but for most of Russia's history, that was in fact the truth.
Yeah, of course. And this came especially out of a lot of the more famous Dagestanis. Habib Nurmagomedov, who the UFC star, very, very famous mixed martial artist, recently retired, or I don't even know how long ago it was that he retired, but I haven't paid too much attention to the sport. But that was basically his response, was these guys were acting on good instinct. They just went too far with it. Which is not great news going forward about any future pogroms that may occur, if it's just, a thing that one does, especially when, as we've said, there are people in Dagestan wasting away in jail for years at a time because they protested against the war. Or especially in contrast with a recent Russian prosecution where a girl put anti-war slogans in supermarkets, including the numbers of Ukrainian casualties. Nothing violent, nothing too big, but she was arrested, went through the trial process, and was sentenced to 7 years in prison for doing that. So put a sticker up saying, Russia is killing Ukrainian civilians, 7 years in prison, do a pogrom, boys will be boys. And on to our last topic, which is much more uplifting than what we've been talking about, is that Ukraine is moving forward with its EU candidacy.
So back during the start of the full-scale invasion, Kyiv presented its membership application to the European Union, kicking off the kind of formal accession process. While it's not a done deal, it's you can't really say that, Ukraine will definitely join the EU. It's definitely seeming like all signs are pointing that way. So the European Commission, which is the executive body of the EU, has recommended that the EU begin membership talks with Ukraine itself, which would be obviously the next step of the membership process. That would make the opening direct membership talks basically moves it from we're considering this to let's actually hash out what a deal would look like, what this accession process would actually look like. It's a signal that the EU has recognized that Ukraine has met most, if not all, of the points that it laid out after granting Ukraine conditional candidate status. So this recommendation means that the EU has recognized that Ukraine has fulfilled nearly all of the requirements set out after the EU granted Ukraine candidate status. But of course, there are still things that Ukraine does need to solve before these negotiations and before accession can move forward. Mainly, according to EU, this is improving minority rights, continuing with de-oligarchization, and continuing with anti-corruption. Those are kind of the three major last steps that Ukraine kind of has to tackle prior to the accession process actually moving forward.
And when you hear protect minority rights in the context of Ukraine, keep in mind that this mostly means language rights, and specifically for the language rights of the Hungarian and Romanian communities, regarding Hungarian and Romanian being used in schools, publishing houses, etc. That's mostly what they're referring to. And immediately after this announcement was made by the European Commission, Hungary said that, no, you are not respecting Hungarians enough in order to fulfill these requirements. We're not going to sign off on it. And then immediately after Hungary said that, as in within 24 hours, Ukraine sent a provisional offer to Hungary with I think it was even delivered in person to Budapest, saying this is this is how we want to solve your concerns. So this is moving very rapidly and being taken very, very seriously by the Ukrainians in order to get around this issue of Hungarian intransience.
According to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, the negotiation process can basically begin immediately once Ukraine has finally fulfilled all of its obligations under the candidate requirements. Once the EU feels that minority rights, anti-corruption, and de-oligarchization have been tackled to an acceptable extent, accession talks can basically begin immediately. A couple of members of the bloc have come out in support of starting negotiations immediately. Slovakia, for example, has said that it is 100% behind Ukraine and behind Ukraine's eventual membership in the EU, and that they're happy to start negotiating as soon as possible.
Which is interesting considering that Slovakia recently elected a pretty, what was considered anti-Ukrainian government. That's interesting to hear.
There are, of course, nations or members of the bloc that will likely not agree to immediate accession talks, like Anthony just mentioned. This includes Hungary. Austria is also likely to be an obstacle. They've expressed, the Austrian government has expressed a lot of skepticism about Ukraine, likely due to the fact that many Austrian officials and top officials are very closely connected to Russia.
Yeah, we haven't talked about it as much, but the Austrian government is heavily penetrated by Russian influence, including Russian security services. Like this is just understood that Vienna is a problem.
And beyond Russia, beyond, of course, Hungary and Austria, which are likely to be the most vocal opponents of Ukrainian integration, there are domestic concerns in some of the member bloc countries that could push the issue either way. For example, currently Polish truck drivers are heavily protesting Ukraine. They've blocked a number of border crossings between Ukraine and Poland. So basically, the truck drivers have also suffered as a result of the lifting of tariffs. Specifically for them, cargo is no longer subject to tariffs between Ukraine and the EU. Means that Ukrainian truck drivers, Ukrainian transit companies can severely undercut them, and they have been doing so. The cost of labor in Ukraine is several times lower than it is in neighboring European countries. And as a result, these carriers have been losing business. So the truckers have been really trying to get government attention and speed up the process for this permit system that used to be in place to be reinstituted. But that is all to say that these domestic issues involving protesting farmers and truckers for a lot of neighboring European countries, especially in Poland, these people represent the voting base for the ruling party. And as a result, these guys are really influential. When it comes to accession talks, it may very well play a role if these issues are not solved by the time they come up. And considering that Ukraine has very few economic lifelines, it really could pose a major problem. Though that isn't to say that Ukraine doesn't have its supporters.
Yeah, so looking forward just at this next meeting of the EU, next summit at the EU, which will be mid-December from the 13th to the 15th. The immediate thing to worry about will be Hungarian transience, about the demands that Hungary will bring forward involving language rights. And we did talk about this like 3 episodes ago, I want to say, just guessing, recently. We've talked about Hungary a lot in the past. We'll talk about Hungary a lot in the future. And that is the kind of next step concern that can block these accession talks. But as these accession talks are going to take place, it's going to be about, brass tacks issues of cost of labor, economic questions that are often quite boring, but actually are the driving force behind most politics. These countries may support Ukraine wholeheartedly, but they also don't want their voters to take any economic hit from a country the size of Ukraine with the labor force of Ukraine that has lower costs than Ukraine. And that's always a problem. So that's really going to be the threat that is not as bombastic as the Hungarians demanding this or that.
And of course, whenever EU accession talks do begin, we will be on hand to cover them in extensive, incredibly dry and boring detail. as we always do here at Ukraine Without Hype.
Maybe vacation to Brussels one of these days. It's been a long time without leaving the country for me. But with that, thank you all very much for listening. If you would like to help out Ukraine Without Hype, like us, 5 stars, thumbs up, recommend us to your friends, your family, share us on social media. We are now on YouTube and TikTok for sharing clips. Percolating what more to do with that, but right now just for sharing clips. If you'd like to support us financially, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join one of our tiers, including joining our Discord channel, which is the most important perk that everyone gets regardless of tier, as well as newsletters, including the one I mentioned about, the theory of occupied Ukraine as a kind of Russian colonial no-law area. And, just engage with us, ask us questions, give us ideas for topics, etc. With that, I would like to thank all of our wonderful patrons who help us out. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Dawson, Giorgio, Ivanika Kratskaya, Michael Drucker, Anna Karen Person, Anonymous, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dmitry Litvin, Etienne, James Burke, Jan, Jenny Louise, Kelvin Alberton, Marguerite, Michael Wickman, Mike Barone, Pedro Lucchini, Shieldwall, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Adam Poppenheimer, Ada McDonald, Alex Groschmal, Anastasia, Barbara, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Emily Bavona, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Poem, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Laura De Leon, Levy Grove, Marianne Abbs, Matt Miller, Melissa Caselco, Anonymous, Noam Hart, Paul Bailey, Randy McNerlin, RDK, Sander Bongers, Sanjay, Scott Barry, Scott Gengris, Scott Tokayuk, Stephen Dan, Stuart Akers, Subtle Knife, Thomas Sobiek, Veronica, Victoria Leontineva, and Wandering Lens. Thank you all very much. You are what make this all possible. So until next week, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.